All right, today we're going to break something down. A really dangerous and honestly surprisingly repeatable pattern. An architecture of control that just keeps popping up all throughout history, a lot of times in places you would never, ever expect. And here's the core idea, the central thesis of this whole thing. The danger, well, it's a fundamental characteristic of any system, and I mean any, sacred or secular, that claims it has a monopoly on the truth. So, you see, this isn't about just one ideology, or one religion, or one country. No, it's about a blueprint for control that can be picked up and used by any group that thinks it has the one and only answer. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the architecture of control itself. Then we'll get into the enemy creation toolkit. Yep, it's a toolkit. After that, we'll see this pattern in history, look at the high cost of it all, and wrap up with a pretty timeless warning. All right, part one, the architecture of control. We're about to deconstruct a blueprint for power. Think of it like a set of rules that connects groups that seem totally unrelated, from ancient cults to modern totalitarian states. The goal here is to see the common structure that's hiding right underneath all the different labels. Okay, so how is this control actually built? That brings us to our enemy creation toolkit. To really spot the pattern, you have to understand the tools used to build it. And what's wild is that it's a surprisingly simple toolkit. But I'll tell you this, once you see it, you really can't unsee it. The first tool, and honestly the most important one, is demonization. Now, this is so much more than just name-calling. It is a systematic, psychological process. It's all about recategorizing fellow human beings as something less, a pest, a disease, a fundamental threat that, in their minds, just needs to be eliminated. And this process, it follows a pretty simple three-step formula. First, you get this Manichaean framing. The world gets painted in these absolute black and white terms, pure good versus pure evil. It's us versus them. Simple. Second, you have moral inversion. This is where the enemy isn't just painted as wrong, but as a moral abomination, something truly vile. And third, and this is key, this whole narrative, it isn't a grassroots thing. It's manufactured from the top down by the state or the institution in charge. The second tool in the kit is called securitization. This is how leaders create the exact crisis they need to justify their power. They take an issue, something that should be up for normal debate, and they declare it a national emergency, an existential threat. And the moment that happens, well, the normal rules of debate, of evidence, they just don't apply anymore. And this comparison right here shows that shift so perfectly. Normal politics is all about debate, evidence, compromise. It's messy, but it works. But once you flip into securitized politics, all that matters is the emergency, total loyalty, and justifying these so-called extraordinary measures. Suddenly, just questioning the official story becomes an act of betrayal. Okay, so now that we have the tools, demonization and securitization, we can start to see the pattern in action. And you'll see how it connects events all across time and all across the globe. Let's start with our first case, post-World War I Germany. The German military leadership, they just couldn't accept defeat on the battlefield. So what did they do? They invented a story, the infamous stab in the back myth. It was a complete fabrication, a total denial of reality. It was a dogma created specifically to demonize an internal enemy, socialists, Democrats, and Jews, and blame them for the loss. And right after that demonization came the securitization. When the German parliament building, the Reichstag, burned down in 1933, the Nazis immediately declared a national emergency. And the result was the Reichstag Fire Decree, which basically erased fundamental civil liberties overnight. Look at this list. This is a perfect example of securitization in practice. A manufactured crisis used to seize absolute power. From there, the state-sponsored demonization became official policy. This slogan here, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, which means the Jews are our misfortune, it was plastered everywhere by the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. This wasn't an argument to be debated, it was a declaration of dogma. It was identifying the official enemy of the state, plain and simple. Okay, now hold that thought and look at this. Decades later, halfway across the world, in Rwanda, in the lead-up to the 1994 genocide, state-controlled radio started referring to the Tutsi minority as cockroaches. The language changes, the countries are different, the decades are different, but the function is absolutely identical. Misfortune. Cockroaches. Do you see it? This is the language of dehumanization. It's designed to psychologically recategorize people as problems that need to be eliminated. And don't think for a second this pattern is just ancient history. Let's look at the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War. The now famous Downing Street memo, it revealed a pretty shocking truth from inside the British government. The memo said, and I'm quoting here, "The intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy." Think about that. That is the very core of dogmatic thinking. The conclusion is decided first, and then the facts are bent, twisted, or just plain fixed to fit. And this quote? Wow, it perfectly captures that Manichaean, black and white framing we talked about earlier. Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists. This is that good versus evil worldview in action. There's no middle ground, there's no room for nuance, there's absolutely no possibility of dissent. You are a friend, or you're an enemy. It's basically the logic of a holy war, but it's being applied to geopolitics. So what happens when a whole society starts to operate this way? What's the real cost when an ideology becomes way more important than actual evidence, and when truth itself is treated like a threat? Well, the damage is pretty staggering, and it spans completely different systems. In Nazi Germany, they rejected what they called Jewish science, things like Einstein's theory of relativity, and it held back their physics. In the Soviet Union, a state-enforced pseudoscience called Lysenkoism absolutely destroyed their biology and agriculture for decades. And even in the United States, the Lavender Scare purged thousands of incredibly talented government employees based on nothing more than baseless prejudice. In every single case, dogma is just poison to progress. This table right here really connects everything we've just covered. You can see the direct line from the mechanism of control, like toxic superiority, to its historical manifestation, like Aryan race theory, and then to the chilling evidence it left behind. It's all part of the exact same architecture. And all of this brings us to our conclusion, our timeless warning. Because the biggest takeaway here isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing a threat that is always present, one that can reappear at any moment. The idea of separating church and state was this monumental step forward for human freedom, right? But the ultimate warning from all of this history is this. Any institution, and especially the state, can become its own kind of church, one that demands total faith, that punishes heretics, and that claims a monopoly on truth. This metaphor of the desert is so powerful. It's not just a physical place out there somewhere. No, it's the psychological and political landscape we create. Right here, whenever we allow fear to silence dissent. Whenever leaders tell us our very survival depends on getting rid of some other. And so we're going to end not with an answer, but with a question for you. Now that you have the toolkit, now that you can see the blueprint, where do you see this architecture of dogma being built today?